All right, so what I'm going to do is I don't know whether, did you do any discussion on comparative politics and IR?
Oh,
We have not talked about comparative really, except a few asides. So if you could talk about that field, especially,
Yeah, and
that
it's
would be
going to be
great.
very general. I have a few slides, and more than anything, what I'm going to be discussing this is to really connect it with my research, because my research essentially it straddles between comparative and IR. So I'm just going to tell you primarily the main differences, the broad differences between comparative and international relations, and why in my research I actually deal with both fields of international of political science. So, and this is a nutshell. I do have a lot of books that you can, a few books that really give you more of a theoretical perspective for both IR and comparative politics, if you're interested. And this is just a few slides so I can deal with my my research. So essentially, there is an important distinction between comparative politics and international relations. International relations studies the economic, military, and political interactions between states. It also studies international organizations, and this includes both intergovernmental organizations, like, for example, the UN, the WTO, the IMF, or international non-governmental organizations, for example, Amnesty International. And also other transnational actors. You can probably, if you're studying IR and you're more into IPE, you could probably be studying multinational corporations. And as Dr. Nizamuddin works on IPE particularly. So you can ask him if you're interested. IR theoretically relies on the classic theories of realism and the more modern neorealist perspectives, and includes some of the main authors, including Morgenthau, Waltz, Mearsheimer, liberalism, the traditional classical liberalism of Kant and Woodrow Wilson, and the neoliberal alternatives of complex interdependence, neoliberal institutionalism, the democratic peace thesis, etc. And also developing world's perspective of Marxism and neo-Marxism, the Prebisch-Singer theory, for example, or Farletto and Cardoso dependency theories. The more modern frameworks of constructivism and feminism are also significant in the IR school of thought. In fact, it used to be called alternative frameworks, but now have become more of the mainstream also theories within IR. If you want to look at some of these theories, Jonathan Crystal, International Relations Theory, Oxford University Press from 2019, covers all these theories. A very good book. Now, comparative politics studies the varied forms of political institutions and behaviors within states around the world. It is built around in-depth case studies of a cross-section of countries around the world. Now, you can study, for example, as it is my case, one specific country and look at subnational level developments as well, or you can you can also deal with a cross-national level analysis. And essentially, comparative politics analyzes differences and similarities between countries or within countries, between subnational level institutions and behaviors. This is important because much of the world's political activity occurs within a country's borders. James Coleman argued that you cannot be scientific if you're not comparing. Swanson similarly emphasized that it was unthinkable to think scientific thought and all scientific research without comparison. Countries are not unique, they're comparable with other countries, and comparing then help us clarify our way of thinking and understand ourselves through the examples of others. So comparative politics is quite different from IR theoretically. since it emphasizes national or domestic approaches over the international level of analysis. For example, the 1960s theories of modernization and developmental theories assume perspectives that deal with socioeconomic issues, and later criticized. The biggest critique was the dependency theories that came from the developing world. New institutionalism, historical or rational choice, deals precisely with how institutions help shape domestic contexts. And political culture studies the shared views and normative judgments held by a population regarding its political system. I remember having to deal with this Gabriel Anmon and Sidney Verba. It was not pleasant. It was not good. It was not very pleasant. But you can look at all these theoretical approaches, and Ronald Chilcott, for example, looks at theories of comparative politics. It's a really good book, and to learn more about theoretical approaches. Now, my research, and this is why I discuss IR and CP, deals with both. And I actually include theoretical approaches from both IR and comparative politics. From the IR perspective, my research analyzes the diffusion of policy. And diffusion is rooted in constructivism. And it seeks to explore how policy processes and policy implementation spread from one country to another and through international organizations. Diffusion is not only of policy; it could be diffusion of regimes. For example, the what is called waves of democratization was a kind of diffusion. All right, I'm not sure whether you have dealt with the third wave of democratization yet, or you are going to, but essentially deals with diffusion of political regimes. There has been theoretical approaches to the diffusion of conflict, diffusion of war, all right? And in my case, I did with more of a policy diffusion, okay? From the comparative politics perspective, my research deals with gender institutionalism. Gender institutionalism explores the interplay between feminist approaches to gender institutions and new institutional theory in order to address issues of gender, politics, power, and change. Institutions are collectively construed values and principles that are maintained by accepted rules of the game. Now, institutions are not, in my case, I do study the typical institutions, in my case, the legislature, but new institutionalism also, and gender institutionalism, can study institutions that are not necessarily your typical institutions. For example, I've read articles on some non-traditional institutions like the Rondas Populares in Peru, which is an alternative to the official judicial system, though is accepted as a system of law and justice in the northern part of Peru, where it's predominantly indigenous. In my case, I work with gender quotas, and the implementation of gender quotas and parity are the rules of the game. And this has prompted change in gender relations when these rules apply. So this is a nutshell of my theoretical approaches to my research. Any questions after here? Well, let me know, and I'd like to be interrupted. Not really interrupted, but raise your hand and let me know if you have questions while I'm discussing these topics. So the first thing I want you to I want to discuss what is the status of women in world legislatures, and what are the obstacles of to participate in the political world for women. So as you can see here, this is the year 1945. I have a little table here from 1945 to 1995. There were, in 1945, there are only 26 parliaments, right? Why do you think there were such few parliaments in 1945? Anybody?
I'm gonna guess a lot of colonization.
Exactly. And most countries were colonies, right? It was not until the 1950s and 60s that you have the era of decolonization, and that's how parliaments increased. In fact, almost more than 70%, all right, parliaments you have in 1995 over what we had in 1945. But look at the percentages of women. So I said more than 70% of parliaments, yet the percentage of women went from 3% to 11.6% in the lower house. MPs stand for members of parliament, right? So it increased only by what? A little bit more than 8.5%. Okay, so we have an increase of 70% in the number of parliaments, an increase of only 8.5 or 8.6 in the percentage of women in the lower house, and even less in the upper houses. All right. Today, there are only 26.7% of women in legislatures, in world legislatures overall. All right. Why? Well, we'll see why in a minute. This is world and regional averages of women in parliaments from 1995 to 2022, and this is from Interparliamentary Union. If you are interested at all about world legislatures in general and women in parliament in particular, this is a great database. You have a database, a monthly database now of women in parliaments. So this is very good if you're interested in this kind of research. Now, why 1995 was important? Because you have the Beijing Conference, it's the 5th Conference of Women, and it was key in promoting the inclusion of women in politics, all right? That conference. So that's where it started, the dramatic increase of women in parliaments. But look at the Americas. From 12.7% in 1995 to 33.8% in 2022. Do you think this is because of the US? No, it's not because of the US. It's because of the rest of the Americas, and particularly Latin America and the Caribbean, right? So the Americas have the highest percentage of women in legislatures today, about 34.7%, followed by Europe, Sub-Saharan Africa, Asia, the Pacific, and Middle East and North Africa. More particularly, this is again the IPU. You can see the countries that have the top 10 countries. Let's look at them. What do you see about this country that makes sense about having the highest percentage of women, or not? Does it make sense? Rwanda is number 1, Cuba 2, Nicaragua 3, Andorra 4, Mexico 4, also 5th, New Zealand, UAE, Iceland, Costa Rica, Sweden, Bolivia. Doesn't make sense. Number 1 and 3 are non-democracies, right? They're not even democracies. So neither Rwanda, Cuba, and Nicaragua, according to Freedom House stats, are considered democracies and non-democratic. Number 4, 5, or 6, Andorra, Mexico, and New Zealand, they are democracies. In fact, they're very advanced democracies. Mexico could have a few issues with civil liberties, but politically, elections are free and fair. They have several political parties and so on. The next one, the United Arab Emirates, is not a democracy, but it has a gender parity, and it has a unicameral legislature that works more as an advisory body, but it has gender parity. It has 50% of women, all right? Then you have one of the most advanced democracies, one of the most liberal democracies in the world, Iceland, Costa Rica, and Sweden. Costa Rica is the role model in Latin America as a liberal democracy. So essentially, you have very different political regimes, very different levels of civil or political liberties, but they're all pushing for gender inclusion, right? I have the second set of countries here because we're going to be discussing Argentina, which is now number 17. It used to be one of the top countries before. Now it has fallen to 17 because many other countries are adopting parity measures, being much more inclusive. And here is the US. We're number 70 of 185 countries, all right? We're very low. We used to be not. When I started teaching this class, we used to be 90 something. So we're much better off than we were, a decade ago, but we're still 70, all right? So 28.9 members of Congress and 24.2 members in the Senate are women. Very low percentage of women compared to most other, to 69 other countries above. So why are women excluded? Well, in theory, the right to stand for election, to become a candidate, and to get elected is based on the right to vote. So if there is a right to vote, then women should be able to be candidates, right? Well, there are most countries in the world, if there is a right to vote, women still do not really present themselves, or they're not elected, as we saw with the stats. There are a few exceptions where women are not allowed to vote. One is the Vatican. The Vatican is only men that elect the Pope, right? Other countries that do not have elections, like we mentioned some before, of fair elections. And, the case of Saudi Arabia, the last time they have an election was in 2015. And it were only local level elections, but women at the time were allowed to vote. So what are the obstacles? Why is it that women do not run for election? Well, number one is, first, some have argued, and this is a little bit outdated, this theory, but I'm going to bring it up. A masculine model of political life and of elected governmental bodies. Some have argued that women really shy away from politics because they do not like the type of competitive model. They don't like those kind of rules. They prefer a more compromise building environment. Although I'm not sure that's the case anymore. Maybe it's the case in some countries, but not really in most countries anymore. Lack of party support. For example, limited financial support for women candidates. So here they run, but they do not really, they are not elected because they don't have financial support. And this is the case of Brazil. In the book, in the chapters of, I only provided a few chapters, but the book that we co-authored with some of my colleagues from Brazil, she argued that in Brazil, women do not get the same financial support as men unless women are going for re-election, in which case, there are still very few women. Socioeconomic obstacles. Well, in this case, and particularly this happens in the developing world, and everywhere else, most women are expected to do the housework, okay? There is actually a clause in the Cuban Constitution, which is never implemented probably, that says that when women and men should do 50% of the housework. It's in the Constitution of Cuba. Although I'm not sure how they can implement that clause, but it is in the Constitution. Anyway, in most cases, women do most of the housework. They are the caregivers. And then if they also have to work outside the home, this is called the double burden for women. And if they also have to run for politics, that's considered to be a triple burden for women. So perhaps some women, and if you look at stats, most women that run for politics tend to be older because they have already raised their families and so on. This is more for the US because perhaps the 1 to 3 does not really apply for the US. But what applies for the US is the nature of the electoral system, which may or may not be favorable for women candidates. In the US, it has been proven that it's not favorable for women candidates. And All right, let me say something else before I get to the electoral systems. Any questions up to here? Cassidy,
Yes.
any of you? Yes, Nicholas?
Yes, I had a question. So
Yes.
on the previous slide, you said the socioeconomic status of women. Isn't that kind of related to like the gap between men and women in terms of like how much each make? Like there's a huge gap between how much women make
Oh,
and how much men make. So
Yeah.
is that kind of related to it?
Yeah, but I was referring primarily of why they shy away from running for politics. And so my argument, the argument made by many is that because women have to more, they have to do the housework, they have to work outside the home, plus they have to run for politics. While men probably, they work outside the home, perhaps, and they just run for politics, but they don't do much of the work at home. And I'm not talking about all of them. I mean, it's primarily the case, and this is one of the factors. Is it okay now, Nicholas? Nick?
Yep. That's
Okay.
good.
Thank you, and
Thank you.
keep asking me questions like that. I like I like it to be a discussion, and I get kind of tired of listening to my own voice after a while. So please interrupt me. This is from the United Nations. This is a very good report, and actually it was put forward by the United Nations in as the 25th anniversary of the 1995 conference that I was telling you about in Beijing. That was very important in the advancement of women in politics. And the report says that 143 out of 195 countries guarantee equality between women and men in their constitutions. But in reality, discrimination against women persists in laws and policies, gender-based stereotypes, and social norms and practices. And you can read the full report later on if you're interested, or let me know if you're interested. I can send you the link. So, what to do? How what have been the policies that have made women really be more represented, particularly in legislatures throughout the world? Well, one of the main policies have been changing the electoral systems. Why? Well, first, because the impact of electoral systems is dramatic. I remember when the chair of my dissertation was saying, I love to deal with electoral systems and voting because they are numbers. And when you're talking about political science, this can be really scientific in real terms. It's not BS, you can actually count the votes, and this is important. And in electoral systems, you can see the differences very clearly, as we want to discuss in a minute. Second, and just as important, electoral systems can be and regularly are changed. When I teach my seminar, particularly in Latin America, they change, they improve. It just needs a law by Congress to change electoral systems, all right? And from countries like Japan, for example, changed its electoral system back in the 90s because they were having a lot of problems with factions. They still have problems with factions, but it's a little better. And why is electoral systems better for women? Because it is a more realistic goal to change electoral systems that benefit women than changing the culture. To change it with a law, you pass a new law. If you want to change a male-oriented culture, it will take a long, long time to have some kind of effect, right? It's much more difficult. So these are all the electoral systems in the world. You would think there are just a few. No, they're not a few. There's so many different electoral systems. And one of the articles I gave to you discussed the relationship between electoral systems and also the chapter 1 of my book, electoral systems and the representation of women. Essentially, you have the plurality majority systems. This is the US has the FPTP, which is per past the post, all right? Which means whoever gets a plurality of the votes, not necessarily a majority, a plurality of the votes, wins the seat. That's it. The majority, or majoritarian systems like France, it requires a majority of the votes in order to win a seat in Congress. For the National Assembly, in order to win a seat in the National Assembly, in the French, in France, you have to have at least 50% of the votes plus one, all right? Otherwise, you go to the second round election. On the other hand, you have the proportional representation systems, which are really dominant throughout the world. I think my chapter said that there were about 70, well, now there are about 90 countries with proportional representation. So this is the tendency for most countries to adopt proportional representation because it's seen as a more fair, more proportional system, okay? And the systems that we're going to be discussing is least PR. This STV, the single transferable vote, only a few countries have. It's extremely complicated, but it's really fair and proportional. Ireland has a system, Malta has a system, and the Senate in Australia. That's it. Most proportional representation have list systems. And then you have the mixed systems, which mix the plurality majority system with the proportional representation. And you have a parallel system where you have two votes, one for plurality, one for proportional representation, or the mixed member proportional, which they actually are combined, and the parties that get, let's say, 10% of the votes, but only like 5% of the seats through plurality are compensated with proportional representation, right? So these are very complicated systems, but it works better if you're thinking about proportionality. You want to have a legislature that looks like your country. If that's what you want, then you get proportional representation, right? So in plurality systems, the winner is a candidate or party with the most votes. Could be a plurality of the votes as it is in the United States, is in the UK, is in most former colonies of the UK, and or majoritarian, like it's in case of France, as I told you, you have to go in a second round election until you get a 50% plus 1%, 50% plus one vote. And typically there is only a single winner in each district. So what happens is, let's say the guy who wins the election in Sangamon County gets, which is Springfield, gets 50%, let's get 49% of the vote. The other 51% of the people who voted, really, those votes are wasted. They're not represented, all right? That's the problem with this kind of system, all right? The tendency is that they're not proportional. They do not represent. The guy who was elected is not going to represent all the voters, all right? It's representing only the people who voted for him, all right? And that's problematic. In proportional system, votes are translated into corresponding number of seats, and each district elects more than one candidate. You have multi-member systems, all right? So instead of electing one person, you elect 5, 6, 7 people, all right? So these are electoral systems at their effects, and they have effect on party systems as well. Single member districts, you vote for an individual, the candidate with the largest share or majority wins the seat, and the tendency to have fewer and larger parties, right? And that is the case of the UK. Well, we'll talk about the UK in a minute. The US, for sure, we have two-party system. Why? Because the third party, even if it wins, let's say 20% of the votes, it doesn't win any seats, all right? It's not going to win seats. So that's a problem. It's wasting money having a third party in the US, right? Proportional representation, on the other hand, you have multi-member districts, and you vote for the party. You don't vote for the candidate. You vote for a list of people. The seats are divided among the parties on the basis of share of votes. and you get the tendency to have more and smaller parties. Most continental European countries, African countries, and Latin American legislatures have proportional representation. The mixed systems, the votes are cast, oh, sorry, I was going to go to the UK here. Votes cast both for parties and individuals. So some seats are filled by individuals, other by party, and the outcome is mixed. The example of mixed systems generally are newer electoral systems. I told you Mexico changed, Japan changed its electoral system in the 1990s, Germany as well, and Mexico in, I think it was 1985 or so, changed its electoral system from plurality from here to mixed member, all right? So let's look at proportionality, and I give you the example of the UK, which has the same system as we have at the national level, not at the subnational level, at the national level. So when you go and vote in the UK at the national level, you just vote for the House of Commons. That's it. The House of Lords is a non-elected body. You just vote for the House of Commons. That's it. So here, this is the last election in 2019. I think the next election in 2025 is going to be very different. But here, the last election in 2019, the Conservative Party got 43.6% of the votes. All right. The total number of seats in the House of Commons in the UK is 650. So if you look at the proportion of seats, they got 43% of the votes, yet they got 56% of the seats. All right. So it's not proportional. They got many more seats than they got the votes. The second, the Labour Party, got 32% of the votes and about 31% of the seats. So here was quite a proportional, all right? Look at the poor Liberal Democrats, all right? They got 11%. This is the third party. That's why you really, you don't have third parties in the US. The third party got 11% of the votes, only 11 seats, all right? So they got less than 2% of the seats, okay? Now, this is very interesting. Look at the Scottish Nationalist Party, Democratic Unionist Party, the Sinn Féin Party, the Plaid Cymru Party. Those are regional parties. So the only way to win seats, if you have regional parties that are really strong. So perhaps we could have a Texan party, all right, or a New Jerseyan party. And then if everyone voted for that Texan party, then you will win some seats. That will be important. Or that's what is happening in the UK. So at subnational level, you have parties that play a very important role. In fact, the Scottish Nationalist Party won 48 seats, even though countrywide they only won 3.9% of the vote share. So they are overrepresented because everyone in Scotland voted for the SNP. It's not going to happen in the next election. Doesn't look like, but it's happened before. So this electoral system, single member district, is a problem for proportionality. All right. This is Sweden. The last election in Sweden, I'm not sure whether this was the last election, probably one before. These are the votes in 2018, all right? The percentages of the votes, Social Democrats getting the biggest pie, the moderate party, the second pie. Look at the seats, extremely proportional. You have proportion of votes, proportion of seats, exactly the same. The cake looks, the pie looks exactly the same. That's what happened with proportional representation, right? You're going to see your vote. If you vote for the smaller party, your vote will be representing the legislature, even if you don't vote for the main parties, okay? So why are PR systems better for women then? And this is the article that you have by Mona Crook, who's a good friend of mine too.
Hey, Adrian.
First of all, more candidates per district are more inclusive of women and minorities. When you have a ticket, let me show you how the ticket will look, and then I'm going back. This is the way a ticket, a proportional representation ticket looks like when you go and vote, all right? So you go and vote for a list, And here are the candidates, and you can see they're already there. You may know number 1 and number 2. You don't know all of them for sure. Generally, they place the top ones, the ones that you recognize at the top. The other ones you have no idea what they are. Right? That's another issue. Yes.
Hey, Adriana,
Yes.
there's a question in the chat right on this
Oh yeah.
topic. Kyle asked, in proportional systems, who decides who will represent the party for each seat? Is it party members and something that looks like a primary, or is it party insiders, or I think there's several answers, but
that's
the
an
question.
excellent question. It depends on the country. Generally, parties have play a much stronger role in deciding particularly the list of legislatures. Otherwise, it'd be very complicated to have to run for primaries for, like 20 seats. Can you imagine per district? That would be extremely complicated. So the party has a strong role. Now, if it is for president, which it cannot be proportional representation for president, is majoritarian always. They do have primaries much like the US. But for candidates in the legislature, generally not. The party plays a very strong role in saying who the candidates are and what positions they are in. So yeah, in that sense, the voter plays a role in voting, but not in deciding who the candidates are going to be.
And they're recruited then.
Yes, the only thing you can do is just not choose that party, choose another one, because you have so many choices if you don't like the candidates. All right. So let me go back to this slide. So this is from, once again, Interparliamentary Union. And the Interparliamentary Union looked at the most gender-balanced legislatures in the world. The top 25 countries with most gender-balanced legislatures in the world. Look at what electoral system do they use predominantly? Proportional representation. 64% of the most gender-balanced legislatures in the world use proportional representation. Second comes mixed proportional, all right? So proportional representation plus plurality. Third is our system. And that's because you have several senates probably that use plurality and that have, and the UK. The UK, for example, have quotas. And I'll talk about that in a minute, how they do it, how they are able to implement it, okay? But essentially, the most proportional, the most balanced legislatures have been shown to be those countries that use proportional representation. Makes sense. Look at New Zealand. New Zealand decided to change the electoral system, as many countries do in the world. In 1993, they changed from majoritarian to mixed member proportional. They didn't go to proportional representation. It didn't go one way or the other one. It went to mixed member. But look at the percentages. How many more women were elected under mixed member proportional than under majoritarian? Right, almost 10% went right after they changed the electoral system. That's what I'm saying. You know, changing culture, difficult. Changing institutions, much easier. It's like an advertisement. So why some, but within PR systems, and that was also in your article, there are some proportional representation systems that work better than others. So this is a little bit technical. I'm going to go a little bit more technical, and it's in the article that I share with you, and also in the chapters that I share as well for reading, so you have an idea already what it is. Systems that have mid to high district magnitude. Essentially, it makes a lot of sense. Like, for example, Chile used to have binomial system. So 2 members per district, all right? Binomial, 2 members. That doesn't really help with proportionality, because if you have 2 members, the chances is you're not going to have a diverse legislature. You're not going to have more women than men, because if the women candidate is placed number 3, it's not going to win any seats, right? Perhaps you get up to 30%, and that's about it, if you're lucky. So mid to high means more than 5 members per district, according to Sugar and Tagapera, who study electoral systems. High party magnitude. So not only you have to have high district magnitude, but you have to have fewer parties. Why? Because the more parties you have, the less the chances that it's going to be very diverse. The number of are there going to be less women, perhaps less minorities as well. So the parties are large, apart from being large high districts, then the lists are going to go deep in into the more diverse pool of candidates. Okay, and then mid to high electoral thresholds. So many proportional representation, in order to not have like thousands of like hundreds of different parties, they have thresholds. So in order to win a seat, you have to win a certain percentage of the votes, right? So it ranges from 1% to up to 10%. Turkey has a 10% threshold. So really it's not proportional representation anymore when you when there 10% of the votes are really wasted. So the more common one is between 1 and 3, and that's probably the ideal type of system. So then types of list PR, right? Stay with me. So there are two main types of lists. Closed list systems essentially are the ones that we have in Argentina. People don't get the chance to choose with the candidates. You just go to vote, and you vote for a list. Let me show you against this list. This is a list. If I like Juntos por el Cambio, I just look at the names, but I cannot make any decision about who I like better than the other ones. I just say, this is a party I want to choose, put the list in the box, and I'm done. In the open list system, you get the chance to vote for the candidates you like, all right? Or not vote for the candidates you don't like, all right? And this is the case of Brazil, Peru, and so on. And many argue if voters have the choice, they tend not to choose women. So PR systems, closed lists, when you get very little choice to the voter, only among parties, is better for women, because otherwise we live in a patriarchal society still, and women are not elected. All right? So this is a system in Argentina. As you can see, and we're going to be discussing quotas in a minute, you can see that you have one male candidate, one female candidate, one male candidate, one female, male, female, male, female. They have to be alternated between genders, right? That's a system that we have in Argentina. Not only you have a list, but you also have to alternate among between men and women, right? So let's go to quotas. Any questions up to here? All right. So there's one other one, isn't it? That's number 2, or did I answer all of them?
Another question, or?
I know. It is interesting that the female representation decreased from 1985 to 1995. If I recall correctly, in the US, 1992 was known as the year of the woman. Thank you. That's a good point. I didn't even think about that. Excellent. It's very interesting. So gender quotas, another way to increase the proportion of women. So you won't change the electoral system is a good way to increase the percentage of women. If you combine that with gender quotas, even better. So one of the best ways, and have been demonstrated to be key, has been the introduction to gender quotas, right? What are gender quotas? Essentially, they're institutional mechanisms. Remember the theory I told you about, the new institutionalism, gender institutionalism, that's exactly what this is. Require a certain percentage of women candidates for legislative elections to be included in party lists, right? So this is by law, by constitutional amendments, in some cases by regulations, all right? They require that if you're going to have an election, parties should be including women, all right? Quotas were considered remedial mechanisms. That is, once the legislature became more balanced, then we wouldn't need quotas anymore, all right? And what was a critical minority? 30%, because they said that if you have 30% of the same gender of women in legislatures, they can make a difference. The outcome could be different. Quotas are now introduced all over the world, particularly for the legislative branch. According to international idea, as of 2021, 138 countries worldwide use quotas with the goal of increasing the presence of women in governmental institutions. 138, 190 countries have some type of quotas, right? So many countries. Because of quotas, countries like Costa Rica, Mexico, Senegal, Rwanda, and South Africa are now contending with the Nordic European countries as world leaders in gender balance parliaments, countries which have for many decades were at the top of the rankings, and now they're not anymore because of these quotas. What type of quotas? Legal candidate quotas or legislative quotas means that they are established in the law or in constitutions. And most Latin American countries have these kind of quotas. In Europe, France, Spain, Italy, Portugal, Poland, Ireland, etc. have this type of quotas, right? And they have parity now, actually. Voluntary party quotas means that only they have gender quotas for political parties. And this is a case of the UK, Norway, and Canada. So, for example, in the UK, you have party quotas for the Labour Party. They have parity. They have to have 50% quota for the Labour Party. And I'm going to tell you how they implement them because they have the same electoral system as we do. And Canada, which they've been trying to change their electoral system for plurality to proportional representation for a while. We'll see what happens if they change it. In the UK, what the Labour Party does, because you have, as I said, single member districts. So essentially it's very difficult. You don't have a list of members. You have just one member. So how do you do? How do you make sure that a woman is elected, that you can comply with this quota? Well, the party, the Labour Party, placed women in winnable constituencies. So let's say East London, all right? They have a woman candidate for the Labour Party because they know they're going to win there, all right? So they place women in winnable constituencies. The same with the Liberal Democrats, although the Liberal Democrats, as we said before, are not very lucky in winning seats, all right? So they also are reserved seats. So some countries, rather than having legislative quotas by law, they just reserve a number of seats for women. And this is happening in many countries that had already ethnic reserved seats for ethnic groups, such as Iraq, all right, and Tanzania, China has reserved seats, Rwanda, all right, they all have reserved seats. These are the countries with gender quotas, all right, some legislative quotas, political party quotas, local government, and so on. So the world of quotas is expanding more and more, right? So implementation, some gender quotas specify the minimum percentage of women that are required in party lists. Others are called gender neutral quotas, which essentially require that neither gender should have more than a certain percentage. For example, in Peru, they said no more than, and Chile as well, no more than a certain percentage of men or women should have seats, all right? So that's called gender neutral quotas, all right? Have they been successful? Well, the success depends on the electoral system, as we discussed before. Some are more ideal than others, and how quotas are designed. So in some cases, they have worked better than others. So here I go to, after all this introduction, I follow with my more specific research, which is the diffusion of gender policy in Latin America from quotas to parity. This is my latest, but this is not my latest research. Now I'm comparing Argentina with Mexico. Okay, that's my newest research. So when I was studying for my PhD, as I told you, the chair of my dissertation passed away. So I had to look for a comparativist, and I did. He specialized in Latin America, and I was taking a seminar in Latin American politics with him, and one of the assigned readings was by Malatun and Jones, who are still professors and good friends of mine. Jones became also a member of my committee, my PhD committee. He's from Rice University, and they have this first article on gender quotas, and they said Argentina was the first country in the world to adopt legislative quotas. And I said, why? Why Argentina? It doesn't make any sense. And did they even know that they were the first ones to adopt this type of quota? No, they didn't even know that, all right? As I learned later on with my research. But essentially, Argentina was the first country, and there was this movement for the adoption of a way in Latin America for adoption of quota, legislative quotas. And many argue that, or myself, I argue that this was the takeoff point for what they call the bandwagon effect that led to a quota movement in the region. And the adoption to the not identical, very similar legislation on quotas. Today, 18 Latin American countries have gender quotas, right? So only 2 do not have it. Guatemala and, Cuba has, they appoint women, but it's not a quota system. And Venezuela has a regulation, not a quota as we would consider in the literature. So how did this happen? Why did it diffuse so quickly? Well, these waves essentially were characterized by the strong role of women's organizations, particularly the UN and the UN Women Conference in Beijing that I referred to it before and again. I interviewed many of these women who were at the conference when I was doing my dissertation, and they from Argentina, and they were telling me that people from all over the world were coming and asking, what are those gender quotas? How do they work? So there was a lot of networking, and they just couldn't believe that there was so much interest on this legislation. The UN Economic Commission of Latin America has been key in diffusion of political, economic, and also a case of gender quotas as well. And leadership roles, because in many cases, it was not only the role of international organizations, but what's happened inside your countries, right? So the role of presidents, the role of women organizations, and so on, was key in adopting gender quotas, not only in Argentina, but throughout Latin America and beyond. So these are the countries now that have quotas, all right? And the ones I highlight is a new, the most recent movement towards parity. So not 30%, not 40%, 50%, all right? That 50% of the seats should be filled by women. And today, there are 10 countries in Latin America that have this system, all right? However, look at the results. These are the countries with gender quotas. Some of these countries have parity. So Argentina, Bolivia, Argentina has 44%, has not reached parity. They have had elections just 2 weeks ago. I don't know the results yet. I'm not sure whether we reach parity this time. I'll let you know if I see you in a few months or so. Bolivia reached parity, 50%. Another country with parity is Costa Rica, 47%. Another country with parity is Honduras, and only has 27.3% of women, all right? So the different electoral systems, the different way that they're implementing the quotas is how they're sometimes more effective than others. Brazil has a gender quota of 30%, yet there are only 18% of women in both chambers combined, all right? And why? Well, essentially because they have, remember when I told you the list system, they have open list system in Brazil. So when voters go, they don't vote for female candidates, they have the list, they can choose the candidates within the list, they tend to choose men over women. And that's why they have not even reached close to the quota of 30% that they have, okay? So essentially, why some quotas work better than others? The electoral system, as I was telling you before, PR, closely system, because we still live in a patriarchal, Latin America is a patriarchal region. That's why you have to give the voter the least possible choices. If they don't choose women, right? Average to large district magnitude, large party magnitude, and 3% threshold of parties. So there are not that many parties. The parties in Argentina tend to be large parties representing 4 or 5, perhaps, even though we have proportional representation. And the quota design, the placement mandate, when they have the first quota adoption back in 1991 in Argentina, they didn't have a placement mandate. Placement mandate means that on the list, they have to be placed in certain positions. So when we had the 30% quota, there should be 2 men and 1 woman, 2 men and 1 woman, or at least 2 men and 1 woman, all right, to get that 30%. Well, before that, there was no placement mandate. Women were placed at the bottom of the list, so they will not be elected. So they had to change the system and establish a placement mandate and place women in specific positions in order to be elected. And enforceability, if you don't enforce, if the political parties don't enforce these quotas, they just cannot present the list in the election, period. All right, they have to change it in 24 hours, otherwise the party is out, all right? So this is the way, this is 2023. This was just a few months ago, the election. This was my candidate, Patricia Bullrich. She didn't win, she came 3rd. And here is Luis Brandoni. Yeah, have you seen, there is a new show called Nada, streaming in Hulu, or Nothing, with Luis Brandoni. This is the Argentine actor, and Robert De Niro. It's a really good show. This is a great actor. Please watch it. It's called Nada. It's only 5 episodes. You can stream it in 1 day. It's a really good show. But here he also ran for Mercosur, because we have not only gender parity for the Argentine legislature, but we also have for Mercosur, which is a regional organization, and for Parlatino, which is the Latin American Parliament. There's also gender parity for all those institutions. So this is the end result of Argentina from the beginning. When we didn't have anything, we didn't have quotas. There was about 3% of women in the upper house and 6% of women in the lower house. When quotas were adopted and improved, percentages have improved also dramatically. As I said, I owe you the 2023 election. Hopefully they reach parity. I think in the lower chamber, the upper chamber has a different electoral system. I can, if you're interested, I can talk about that later on. But it will be more difficult for the Senate to reach parity, all right? So this is a new trend. They went, as I said, from quotas that range from 20 to 40% to parity, 50%, all right? Now the idea is it should be, if we are 50% of women in a given country, we should have a legislature that mirrors the way the countries are composed by gender. And also, there are quotas by ethnic group, indigenous people, and so on in many of these Latin American countries, right, as well. Again, the external developments, including the Economic Commission of Latin America and their triennial regional women's conference, play a key role in promoting parity. So they said, we don't want quotas anymore. We want to go beyond quotas. We want 50-50 because we live in democracies. And as I said, we are 50% of women. We should have 50% of the seats in Congress. All right. So what is the difference between the first wave of quotas and the second wave of parity? Well, the scope quotas were intended as remedial mechanisms. I told you, the idea was once we reach that percentage, we can get rid of quotas. Well, parity is permanent. There's no attempt to say these are remedial mechanisms. No, we should have a system that represents society, institutions that represent society as they are. The extent quotas have been generally restricted to legislatures. Parity systems have been more comprehensive. Germany, for example, has parity as CEOs, companies, private companies. They have to have parity in their. I think it happened right last year, 2021, that they adopted parity in private companies in the composition of the top level directory. This course, parity is also seen as means to achieve gender equality more broadly and a symbol of equal representation in democratic systems. That's it, all right? Quotas, on the other hand, were regarded as a means to remedy past discrimination, all right? So these are the countries with parity in Latin America, yet, as you can see, even the countries with parity, some of them have not reached parity. The case of Honduras, for example, is what people say is because they have parity only for single member constituencies. And we know how that works or doesn't work, all right? It's very difficult unless it is intentional from the part of the political party to place women in winnable single constituencies. Otherwise, they don't win, all right? The case of Panama. Panama has parity. Panama has parity only for primary elections. So once they get to the general election, they don't require parity. So this is why they have only 22.5% of the seats represented by women. In the subnational level, Argentina has 24 districts, much like the US. It's a federal system with very different electoral system. In fact, much different from the US, and they have very different electoral systems, each of the provinces. And some provinces have, most provinces have quota and parity. There are only 2 of the 24 provinces that don't have parity. And you can see the case of Tucumán, it has only 20% of women, also because it had an electoral system that is that's not very fit women at all. I can talk about that electoral system later on, but it's almost 8 o'clock. So if you're interested, just send me an email, okay? So parities, Argentina is a model party, is doing very well in the legislature, but if you look at the other branches of government, it's doing extremely badly. Why? Because there's not such thing as parity or gender quotas in the other branches of government. So if they don't have parity, they don't have women, period. That's the way it is. So here's the judiciary. As you can see, most women are represented in administrative positions, but once they become judges, prosecutors, public defenders, which is a very important position in Argentina, being a public defender, very well paid actually. There are very fewer and fewer women, right? They don't have quotas, there are less women. The executive, same thing. So despite Argentina having had 2 female presidents and 3 female vice presidents, the current government has only 22% of the total cabinet positions. All right, that's it. And women governors have decreased, were decreased in the last election to 0.08%. All right. So we still live in a very patriarchal Argentina. All right. Women mayors are around 12% of the total, and only 2 provinces have more than 20% of the total mayors. All right. According to a journalist, she said that women mayors in Argentina, the situation of women mayors in Argentina is like an obstacle race. So it's very difficult to be a mayor, to become a member of the cabinet, just because there's no such thing as quotas of parity. As you can see, this is since Argentina has become a democracy in 1983, percentages have increased, but they have still around 22%. All right. Still, I want to finish in a good note. We have what we call the feminization of Latin American politics. Mexico, for example, has adopted gender parity in everything since 2019, all right? In everything means in every public post, from mayors to governors to legislators at both national and subnational level. That's why they are reaching parity at really rapid rate. And next year, the chances are that Mexico will have its first woman president, because the 2 members of the most important parties, the national PAN and Morena, is the current ruling party, are both women. Xiomara Castro, the first woman president in Honduras after a terrible coup d'etat a few years ago in Honduras, Xiomara Castro was elected president, and it has worked quite well. All right, you don't hear much about the politics in Honduras very much, because she has stabilized the country politically. And this is Patricia Bullrich. I interviewed, that's my picture with her when I interviewed her for some of my work. And she came third. We thought she was going to win the election. She didn't. The runoff election is going to be between two males anyway. But yeah, I'm bummed that she didn't win. Many other countries have had women presidents, including Brazil, Chile, Costa Rica, Nicaragua, and so forth and so on. So I think this is a good outcome, although, you know, there's a lot that we need to do. And this is myself a few months ago. This is called the Women's Bridge in Argentina. It was built by a very well-known architect from Spain. And as you can see in the back, it says mujeres, ciencia, no, creencia, no, what is it? Creencia, duda, independencia, empatía, poder, placer. So this is in Buenos Aires, and this is a beautiful bridge called the Women's Bridge. And we have all these, we have a minister of women right behind there, and I have a picture like with my fist up. Go Argentina. So that's it.